Hi, everyone. My name is Marissa True. We are back with another episode of TezTalks Radio. And today we have Maria Caballero, the co-founder of The Verse and an award-winning poet and artist. So before we dig into all the questions, Anna, how are you today?
Very well, Marissa. Thank you. Happy to be here.
So we've actually encountered each other a few times, mainly offline, but finally had the privilege of interacting in real life. But I've been following your work around the verse. We've interviewed Sasha in the past, and we've always been curious about the evolution of poetry as an art form within the decentralized space, particularly here on Tezos. But before we get into all of that, can we talk a little bit more about where you're from and how your journey into the blockchain world began?
Of course. I've been writing poetry my whole life. I took workshops in high school, and was always writing. I lived in Colombia for many years. I'm from Colombia. I've lived between the U.S. and Colombia on and off, but I spent my 20s in Bogota. And was writing a lot in Spanish and had all these poems upon poems. Um, and then when my son was born, I finally stopped working. I'd worked pretty consistently since graduating from college in all sorts of communications related work. I worked for the vice president of Colombia, for example, helping coordinate international press, and also worked as a freelance journalist for several years in New York, actually. Um, and I took these poems, Marissa, and I organized them into a collection in between sort of my son's naps, really, and sent them out to several contests. And they actually won. I became the first woman to win Colombia's José Manuel Arango National Poetry Prize. I was really surprised for a young poet to win that award was very unexpected. And this collection is called From Sunday to Sunday, Entre Domingo y Domingo. And it really is a faithful rendering of what it's like to be a young single woman in a massive South American capital city with a facade of conservatism and an underpinning of really just a wild underground, like vibrant, pulsating Latin American city, and sort of feeling at the crossroads of that and what it meant to not want to get married and what it meant to be single and to enjoy that and to work, and also sort of the void of the 20s. So every other poem in this book starts in small cities. Of course, Bogota is a massive city with millions of people, but that's how the book is organized. There's a Sunday, every other poem, a Sunday poem, and the rights to this book were actually acquired recently by a Spanish publishing house, and it was reprinted in January. And they publish it again, and we're going to be at the Madrid International Book Fair at the end of May with the book. And actually, one of my friends in the blockchain, an incredible artist called Tim Maxwell, very, very active on Tezos, did the cover art. And so I'd published this book, and then I was like, oh, I guess I should organize my English poems. And I did that, and I published 2 chapbooks, and was really happy, to sort of get published and have my work out. But it also felt that there was something anticlimactic and quiet and unnecessarily lonely and insular about traditional publishing. I mean, of course, there's something that didn't add up monetarily because you usually pay money to get published or get considered to be published. And then once you're published, there's usually no payment or no understanding really of who your audience is. But really, I just wanted to connect with readers and with people. And so I started sharing my poems as very simple video animations on social media. And then when I read about the blockchain, it just made a lot of sense to me to transact my poetry via the provenance that it affords, and to not only transact my own work, but the work of all the poets that I knew by then. So I had this idea to create a poetry gallery. I'd never seen that before. I'm like, but let's do a gallery. I didn't want it to be a literary journal because I felt that eventually volunteer efforts tire, and I wanted it to at least aspire to be a self-sustaining model. So I wanted to create this gallery, and I bought the domain for the verse in a supermarket parking lot. The name came to me, and I'm like, oh, that's it. I went on GoDaddy and bought, the verse dot everything that was available, and started just engaging with people on Twitter and figuring things out slowly on Discord. And I was invited to be part of this project called Ether Poems that minted poetry onto the Ethereum blockchain. And I met two wonderful writers there, Kalani Wamoto and Sasha Stiles. And so I said, hey, I have this idea for a poetry gallery. I love your work. Let's partner up. And so, we did, and we launched this gallery almost 2 years ago, where we've been really, working so hard to present poetry in unexpected places.
I think what's so beautiful about that story is that you clearly recognized, your talent for writing, and it was embedded throughout your career. It was validated by the fact that you won this competition, but there was something about the art form that felt fairly solitary. So it wasn't necessarily purely, I guess, the conventional route for people into the blockchain realm, where it's all about, I guess, the democratization or the inclusivity of like the financial model, and making sure that it's all about giving poets money where they are owed it for their work, even though that's still very fundamentally a part of it. But this notion of introducing yourself to this idea of community. One question I wanted to ask was, when you initially explored the idea of putting together a poetry gallery, was that because there was not yet this space for the written word as an art form, so you were attempting to fit it to the mold of where art was being accepted on chain? Or was this something that you were already exploring in terms of this notion of the intersection of art, like I guess visual art and the written word?
Um, I think I've read somewhere that, simple ideas just are good ideas usually because they just feel like they're true, they're real. And for me, it was, people understand what a gallery is. A gallery is a place where you buy art. So I wanted it to have a format where people would understand, okay, you come here and you're going to buy art because poems are art. I always felt poems were works of art. I grew up between Colombia and Miami, and Miami's a city transformed by art, very, very literally. Art Basel really changed the city, and poetry didn't really have a participation in this, and I thought that it should. And not just sort of text-based works where you see language incorporated, but poems like the ones I was writing and like my colleagues and friends were writing don't really have a participation. I always wondered why, for example, E.E. Cummings wasn't exhibited in the MoMA alongside a Jackson Pollock, for example. Movements that have transformed culture and how people engage with language, with art, with visuals, for me belong together. They belong together, and they should be curated, they should be exhibited, and they should be collected as such. But really, poetry had a logistical issue. Its collectability was complicated by the fact that, you print books and you pay, $13, $14, $15 for a poetry book, which has perhaps, 48 poems, 50 poems, and it's not going to represent the craft of the poet. It doesn't honor the work of the poet, the years, the decades that could be spent writing these poems. It's not going to sustain the poet, but it's also probably not going to be exhibited in a way where you can engage with it in a public space. And I think that there is something about, there's obviously the I feel complete like love, and everything in me feels like reverence for the printed page and for books. But there's also a part of this experience that is gained by being public. I mean, we go to church and we go to mass and we go to holy places in public to worship in public. And there's this whole private public dialogue and dialectic that goes on. And I think poetry really didn't have that public space to give it its proper sort of reverence, to accompany that of the page. And so I really felt, Marissa, that we just needed to bring on new thinking. And what I love about Web3 is that it invites new thinking. And it was time for poetry to be valued as art and exhibited and curated and transacted as art, and to overcome the logistical problem or setback that it had via blockchain provenance. So for me, it was like paying poetry its dues.
Again, I think it's really fascinating to see your perspective on how, you know, the the sheer value of poetry as an art form is kind of all around us, but it doesn't carry the same immediacy as an art piece in a gallery, simply because you need to seek it out within a book. You need to kind of know where to look. So the relationship between poetry and, I guess, the digital world is something that's still fairly nascent. And so the fact that you're very early on, or very quick to basically try to work out the best ways in which we can shine new light onto poetry in a
Mm-hmm.
variety of different formats, I guess, is something that I think the majority of us who, perhaps don't, or are not as immersed in poetry, or surrounded by poets, or surrounded by people whose focus is on their literary craft, like, we don't see those friction points, so we don't, I guess, necessarily acknowledge the frustrations or the friction points where we are not getting as much access to this art form as perhaps we should be. So how does that tie into, I guess, the vibrancy of the Tezos community, and how poetry really found a home there? How was it initially received? How did people come to recognize it within that space as one of the first sort of um, budding areas?
Well, I feel like the Tezos community is just so vibrant in general and so open to newness, right? There is really a desire to push boundaries as a collective whole within the Tezos ecosystem, and to welcome and celebrate those who are doing so in a thoughtful and rigorous way. So, right away, I felt like I was welcome into Tezos. I think I minted my first poem right after I entered Web3 onto Hicket Nunk. And it was for one of those relief efforts. I forget which one it was, for I think a natural disaster or something had happened. And the Tezos community, that just shows, the Tezos community always comes together to have these fundraising efforts, to help others. And I think that, it was part of this initiative, and it sold like, in a couple of days it was all gone. And I donated all the proceeds. And then, I just was like, well, let's do more. I want to do more. And then I participated in Art for Ukraine, for example, curated by Sky Nicolas and Amir Fallah and Eyal Krego, and a few of sort of the leading figures in the Tezos fine art ecosystem. And that was an incredible experience where you saw, thousands of Tezos raised in hours for Ukraine. And so I think that, I felt a little bit, starstruck when I was invited to be part, for example, of that exhibition, because it was incredible artists were participating. And then I realized, this is exactly what I've been working for, to have a poem be recognized on equal ground as an artwork by Bjorn Calleja, for example, who is, such an amazing artist. And it was received on equal ground. So I think it's to the credit of the ecosystem, both from a collector standpoint to an artist, curator, and thought leader standpoint?
I think something that we hear on this podcast time and time again is genuinely the power of the Tezos community in rallying in times of need, just like in these fundraisers, but also just like the sheer diversity of the people who participate in these, and the way that these relationships are sort of built around the world, because all of you have one commonality, which is your passion for the art form in or passion for art in every single form, but also just, a passion for supporting one another in the community. um, Obviously, I think, or perhaps not so obviously, I think the blockchain poetry itself started as a a more niche pocket of on-chain art and like the cultural sphere. I think it took some time for people to really register the written word as an art form, not just on chain, but off chain in general. But then now that we've had continued exposure to us, it almost seems natural and intuitive. But to zoom out slightly, can you give us more of an idea of what the literary universe actually looks like on chain? And what this poetry sphere, like how that specific community exists, how they interact with one another, and what that world looks like.
Sure. I mean, I think more and more people are, it's always a flux, right? People are entering and people are leaving, people take breaks, people come back. But I think something that I've noticed, Marissa, in my own sort of experience in sharing the work that I'm doing is before there was like a total disinterest in what I'm doing from the traditional literary community. And then it evolved into a really sort of conscientious interest. There's like a legitimate interest in what's going on, a desire to learn, if not to participate, at least to learn and to understand what it is that is going on. Within the ecosystem, there's writers from all over the world. More and more poets are I think entering, looking to mend, but looking to find a community. I mean, I think everyone realizes that you can't do this alone. You need to be plugged into some form of community. And I have to give Callan Iwamoto major props because she was the founder of the crypto writers community, and on Discord, and that's a great landing spot for so many poets. The work of someone, for example, also like Lawrence Fuller, who's who's brokered incredible collaborations between poets and artists and really well-known Hollywood figures as well, has drawn incredible attention to the work of poets on the blockchain. So I think that every effort matters. At the Verseverse, we're always engaging with people who have questions and seeking to host Twitter spaces where we can answer these questions, these workshops, because of course, like, these one-on-one requests for information are unsustainable to attend all of them. So it's better to just do it from a public arena where everyone can benefit and people can just really sort of sit in and learn.
So then, as this community grew, I was reading one of your articles, I think it was the one you published on Right Click Save, was this notion of the the growth of, or the idea of giving poetry more cultural agency. And that was something that, again, is to bring more focus to poetry as an art form where, as you said, it was often overlooked or under recognized for its significance. So how has its presence and the growth of these communities within the blockchain space really given it this like this notion of cultural agency as compared with what it had before?
Well, I've exhibited my work, Marissa, in places where I don't think I know a poet hasn't exhibited before. I mean, I gave the first poetry reading at Gazelle Art House in London. I was just recently at Bit Forums at an exhibition curated by my incredible friend and curator Alex, who did just such an incredible work of bringing together a different group of artists working in pushing what the generative art form looks like. And the gallery said, this is the first time we're working with poetry. And it's so exciting to work with poetry. So, I don't think that there's any question that we're introducing poetry to places where it hasn't been there before. We, at the Verse, we curated Feral Files' first poetry exhibition on Tezos. And this was last month. We were just at Proof of People, organized by Refraction and Vertical Crypto. And there was so much poetry. There was a panel on poetry. There was poetry exhibited in numerous places. We also had an exhibition that we created from the Verse, especially for this occasion called Poesía de Protesta, Poetry of Protest, which featured all poems in Spanish, not translated, but in Spanish, read by their poets. Curation was by an Havana-based art historian in Glais Garrote. Production was by our community manager, Elizabeth Sweet. And it was, we were bringing Spanish language poems to New York. And they're they're on object in Spanish. So we also want to create opportunities for people who aren't just English speakers. And many of these poets were minting for the very, very first time.
What's incredible to see, I think, is the rapid maturation of, I guess, the structure around poetry as an art form within the blockchain space. And that's where we introduce ideas. I mean, first of all, these galleries, these meetups, these prominent events that are really giving poetry the legitimacy that it's due. But in the same vein, watching this maturation means that we are looking at how poetry or the treatment of poetry will evolve over the course of time. And what's always interesting about the blockchain space is that, people have often applied decentralization as both like a technical and a social characteristic of blockchain. And then tenets of decentralization are kind of this idea of fostering inclusivity and of fairness. And I think what's interesting about hearing these examples of how the community is rallying together and like really, like I said, giving the stage that poetry is due, how do these principles of decentralization really apply to poetry? How does it apply to the written word as compared with, say, I guess the typically more financial arguments to people's involvement in the blockchain?
I was so happy to work with Alex Esterick, the editor of Right Click Save, on that article that you read, because he's such a brilliant mind, and I think he really is there for the right reasons, and that is to open the door so that other art forms can participate. I mean, the fact that I even have such an esteemed home for that article says a lot about not only the work of Right Click Save, but of the environment in which we're in. I think that there's sort of my argument in that article is two-faced. One is I think that the poets of Web3 need to assert their value rigorously, daily, fearlessly, shamelessly. Like, this is important work and we want you to collect it and we want you to transact it and we want you to engage with it. But I also think that there's this component that is not centralized necessarily, which is poetry should be curated into exhibitions. Poetry should be presented as art by people who have the legitimacy of years of study. So, even for example, one of the most sort of symbols of decentralization, the Museum of Crypto Art, they invited us to curate an exhibition for them on poetry. So yes, we're in decentralization. Yes, this is a decentralized museum, but there is still somebody there saying, hey, we think the Verse is doing cool work. Hey, Anna, are you free, next month? Can you do this for us? Can you put together this exhibition? We want to showcase poets. And the reason why this is happening is in part because the poets of Web3 are asserting their value. So sort of that article says, it argues in favor of having it both ways, of having poetry curated into, you know, special exhibitions. For example, the exhibition that took place at Bitforms recently and at Gazelli Art House. I also have a poem in an incredible LA gallery called Epoch Gallery. So I'm very happy, you know, to be included in these exhibitions, but at the same time, there is noise being made thoughtfully within the Web3 poetry community saying, hey, we're doing valuable work. Listen to us. And the fact that these two things are happening at once is the sweet spot, is where I think we will be able to see change happen. And it is, you know, people are including poetry into shows. They are taking us into account.
Yeah, I think it was within that same article. I actually wrote down one of the quotes because I thought it was so succinctly put, which is Web3 also reminds us that the curated and uncurated need each other, where the former enfolds art within a two-ply cloak of history and context. The latter brings immediacy and innovation, followed by the idea that curation legitimizes disruption. So, in this idea of kind of requiring both ends of the spectrum to exist, is there friction there, or what are the friction points, or has there sort of been this seamless partnership where one seems to legitimize the other in this positive feedback loop?
I think there's always friction, and I think friction is, it's good. You know, those rough edges are where it's sometimes you need to go through the rough edges to make change happen. It's not easy, but you know, at the end of the day, whether you're in Web3 or any industry, you're working with people. And it's always a challenge to work with people. There's so many desires and hopes and dreams and insecurities mixed into every single body. So I think that there's always friction, and no matter, you know, how positive you want to spin it. But, you know, it's always a question of who gets to tell the story at the end of the day. And it's not always, you know, a fair balance of who ends up getting exhibited or shown everywhere. It's you know, it's negotiations, lots of negotiations, Marisa, have to happen. You know, why am I speaking to you versus somebody else? Like, you never really know what the steps are to get you where you are. So I think that, you know, within this ethos, because for me, Web3 beyond crypto art, beyond an aesthetic, is an ethos. It's not an aesthetic, it's an ethos. And so we want participation is important, inclusivity is important, but it's also, you know, at the end of the day, not everyone's going to make it, right? That whole thing of everyone's going to make it, and it's all, you know, everything is dandy and perfect. I think there's a reckoning that's that's happening in the space where we're all waking up and realizing, you know, to put our artwork forward. It doesn't, it, you know, you can't just sort of tweet about it all day. There needs to be some real depth, some real hard work, rigor, I think is a very important word. And then we also need people to believe in us. And I feel that being able to communicate what you want and how you want it and why you want it is a gift. Perhaps poets have it. And to be able to connect with those who will listen and to give you a platform is also a gift. And then, you know, once you have a platform, to open it up to others and to allow as many as possible to participate is important. But there is friction, and I think there is friction within all communities. You know, even traditional poetry land, there's tons of friction there about who gets read and who gets published. My mentor, Denise Duhamel, one of my mentors, says the land of poetry is so cutthroat because there's nothing at stake, which is, of course, such a tongue-in-cheek statement, which speaks to the problems of traditional poetry not having the valuations that perhaps it should. But traditional publishing is cutthroat, you know? So I think that there's friction. Of course, there's friction.
And in that friction, is that with the intent of driving an outcome that is essentially a balance between this traditional poetry world and I guess this on chain poetry world? Or are we trying to create systems that learn from one another and can exist both independently and together? Because I think a lot of the discourse can sometimes find itself speaking of the blockchain art space or web3 as a whole or as an ethos as you suggested as an alternative or as a replacement rather than, as we spoke about just slightly before, this duality and making sure that both can improve at the same time. How do you see that relationship evolving?
I see it, you know how I see it evolving, Marissa, quite honestly. I see Web3 sort of pummeling forward and the art world and it really coming together in a way that's exciting and explosive in a ways that you're already seeing it. You're already seeing major galleries sort of turning their heads and seeing what's happening, museums as well, no doubt. So I see that continuing. And then I see traditional publishing getting lifting its head from its books, turning around and saying, hey, what's going on over there? Let me come closer. And wanting to participate, not only in, let's say, poems as works of art, right? Individual video poems, but I think in publishing, for me, you know, ebooks are $1 billion industry. And the mental leap from a painting to an MP4, I give you that. That's a big leap. But the mental leap from a Kindle or an ebook to an NFT is tiny. It's a tiny step. And what you're gaining as the publisher is a type of provenance and information and knowledge about who your audience is that is absolutely powerful. I mean, there is a possibility to have a back and forth. And I would suggest that publishers start with young adult literature, that genre, which is, you know, children that speak to their parents in a way that their parents are really going to pay attention, I think. A 12-year-old talking excitedly about something perhaps is different than a 5-year-old. As a parent, from experience, I can sort of attest to that. And if a child is telling you, hey, this is important, this is interesting, and, now that I bought my Harry Potter NFT book, I want to buy, Harry a new hat for his game that we're playing now, or whatever else, what have you. I think, I'm doing that all day long for video games, negotiating with my kids, saying, no, no, no more, you can't get that, you can't get that. You know, there's no difference, Marissa, this, from a 12-year-old wanting to get, to advance in a game, but put it on the blockchain where you know exactly who and why and where. And then you can have a dialogue. You can send and you can receive. I have books on Amazon. I have no idea who's bought them. No idea. But I've also sold books as NFTs. I have a collection of short stories that I launched as an NFT, and I know exactly who's owned it. And I know who's resold it. For example, I sold an edition to a collector of mine, an incredible photographer named Tony Korosher, who collected one of my Tezos one-of-ones. And he listed he bought a few, and then he listed one. And that one was purchased by Keith Grossman, who was then president of Time magazine. So there's a provenance to a story being told via ownership that will capture a history and a moment in time where things were fresh and young, that I think is a layer of power to the asset itself, to the digital asset itself.
It almost alludes to this idea of the immediate archiving of what people are rapidly recognizing as the creation of a basically a profound moment in history. But then and I think that's kind of how we see the space evolving from, let's call it a macro lens. But then when you drill into, individual artists and poets like yourself, it's this idea of the creation of dialogue between your work, you as the creator, and the collector, and also the community, people who consume your work. And so I think, exactly as you said, like there's this constantly evolving and morphing relationship. And is this something that you feel is predictable in terms of, as as this dialogue continues, it's step by step changes where you can kind of follow along and everything seems like one natural evolution of the thing before it? Or is this happening at such a rate that everyone needs to, for lack of a more elegant phrase, wing it when it comes to how you interact in this space and how you foster that dialogue with, the people who consume your work and appreciate your work?
There's a lot of improvisation, let's say. I think that one of my favorite people, of course, many others to follow is Art Gnome on Twitter, and he always says there are no experts. There are no experts. We're learning. We're all learning. I think there is experience that is being gained, and people who have vision and understand what this technology can afford for whatever their practice or medium might be. And it has to be something that's beyond sales. Sales are a definite component to the mix, but there are statements of value. So I have a poem, for example, Marissa, right now with the Museum of Newfangled Art on object, and I think sort of they for each artwork in their exhibition, they created 50 editions, and my artwork, my poem, has been one of the top selling pieces in the exhibition. I think we sold like 12 in the last 24 hours. And for me, beyond the fact that there are transactions taking place, is that there are statements of value for a poem that I would have probably written. Who knows, at what point it would have been published after months and months of trying with traditional publishing to get it out in the world. But now it not only exists, on social media where people can see it for free and enjoy it. It's out in the world at no cost. But there are, you know, I don't know, I think almost 30 people already who have said, I want to own this as art. This poem is art. And so these statements of value are incredibly meaningful. And I just want more of these to happen for myself and for other poets. Because I think that to collect poetry in a way that reflects its contribution to culture is to give it agency, it's to honor the work of the poet, and it's revolutionary. I really don't think anything less than that.
I think, as you said, if there's a large degree of improvisation, we have to accept that this is a constantly iterative process. There is no clear cut correct path, but in the same way that if these are the values that are driving the momentum of the space, then at least it is some kind of confirmation or reassurance that we are on the right sort of course. And I think having figures like yourself, Sasha, Jason, Alex, everyone contributing to the dialogue, it's contributing to the discourse, is what's going to make sure that we ask ourselves the critical questions that are necessary in this space to make sure that we don't get cast astray and then end up in this space that's kind of too focused on the monetization of artwork and the trading of artwork, which I think is a fear for many creators in the space. Um, and yeah, I think there's just a lot of questions that have yet to be asked, and a lot of questions that we maybe haven't even realized need to be asked. Um, but then I don't want to leave this conversation without actually addressing your work. I think a lot of what we've spoken of has highlighted your work, but in principle, it's been more about your relationship to the blockchain space and how it's impacted, your poetry as art. But then it's also about the impact that you are making into this space that I think bears mentioning. Um, I've read a few of your poems. Particularly enjoyed. I think it was vasectomy, and I thought it was so profound. I loved that it was in such a long form where it was almost a story being told. Um, it was
It's a
very, very
scientific
profound.
method that you learn in middle school.
Yes, and the structure of the scientific method being applied to such like a deep rooted human experience,
Messy.
very messy, applying structure to something formless as the human experience. I think I think it's fascinating. It left me with a lot more questions and a lot more answers, but it also gave me this deep-rooted feeling of familiarity, I guess, in modern womanhood and the questions that I ask myself or the experiences that I see as common for many women. And so I wanted to understand a bit more about, like the themes that you're exploring in your work and how they are received in the blockchain space, because they are making such a profound impact, but how do you see them received?
My work, Marissa, really accompanies my life. It's very true to what I'm experiencing, and I really feel that it's via the personal that you can access the universal. Via blunt, complete, brutal honesty. You can pretend to be relatable when works of poetry sort of enter the realm of platitudes and generalizations. I find it very hard to sort of feel engaged or feel an emotional reaction from them. And I think that we go to art to feel something, to learn and to feel. And so if, hopefully art can do that for us and poetry as well, because otherwise, we're probably not going to come back to it. And my work really speaks to my experiences of the past decade as a young mother and a wife and taking care of children while working, and feeling all the pressures of modern womanhood where we're told that we have access to everything. We can have it all, right? But I don't think that's true. I think, it's exhausting. And I think as women, we are paying a disservice to each other by not acknowledging the hardships, by glorifying motherhood, by romanticizing, you know, what it is that goes on in the home. I think it's better for everyone if we just tell the truth. And that's what my poetry does. It tells the truth. And it's all very personal. You really feel like you have sort of a window into my life when you read my work. And what's never ceases to sort of surprise me, Marissa, is how many women really, I think men too, but the women are, always saying, I relate so much to this. Thank you for saying it. A lot of men are like, does your family read your work? And then I like to quote Czesław Miłosz, the Nobel laureate, who says, once a writer is born into the family is finished. Um, and, it is what it is. I think many don't read it because they don't want to, and I don't blame them. And Alice Ostraker, one of my favorite poets, always says, I write about family endlessly, endlessly. And for better or for worse, or, however disjointed they may be, we all have a form of family. And there's so many things that go on that we think only happen to us, but they're happening to everyone or to many of us all over the world. So to say things as they are is a form of courage. I think it was Virginia Woolf who said that any woman who tells the truth is a feminist. And I'm just telling the truth.
No, I completely agree. And as I said, just reading your work for the first time, I personally was not prepared for the impact that it had on me. Typically, because there were a lot of experiences. As you said, you explore the notions of young motherhood. I myself don't have children, but I felt my ability to feel empathy for the state that you were in because I could understand where many of the factors that were influencing your emotions were coming from, and then therefore finding myself being, I guess, riled up and defensive or protective of you, as even though, you're the writer that's so far away. Um, and then also when we're talking about the generative literary form, then we're seeing this interplay of technology into something that's such a fundamentally human experience. And as you said, you're exploring ideas that are so common to women that they're almost considered mundane, but they're the things that create pain in so many women's lives, or create friction and create doubt and questioning. And so it begs so many different questions. But one, I guess, potentially naive one that I really came away with was, does the existence of this kind of poetry on chain help the artwork's messaging resonate deeper? Like, do you feel that there is a reception to your poetry within this space that is different to, say, the traditional, if it were to be presented in, the physical space of a gallery versus within the blockchain art community?
I think the art world in general wants things that have a message because it's probably going to be meaningful, right? And so, therefore, more relevant for the future. But the blockchain space, for me, obviously it's a very male-heavy environment. As you know, we live in a male-led society, and that's just the truth. And blockchain is sort of an extreme window of that. But I always wondered who was going to, collect my poems about breastfeeding, collect my poems about womanhood, about motherhood. And a lot of my collectors are men, and I think that I think they're special. Honestly, I would say that the collectors of my work are visionary and special because they are seeing that my voice is the voice of the many, and they are supporting it by by saying this has value and this deserves to be transacted. And it's not for everyone. It's not for everyone, and I'm okay with that because I rather produce something that has meaning and has value than poems about beautiful sunsets, where I don't think I'm gonna sort of beat the greats at that. So I'd rather write about waking up and getting two kids out of the house in time for school when my husband is out traveling and traveling. I think that more people can relate to that and take value, extract value from it, gain value from it, because I think that there's this sensation of being heard, right? You feel heard.
Mhm. And I think that's probably the most profound value that someone can extract from your work, is this sense that, like I said, this fundamentally human experience is recognized, that it is not necessarily unique to each of us. We are not alone in a lot of these experiences, and to have someone crystallize it into an art form is to acknowledge that we are very much enduring something of a common struggle, or that there is at least solidarity with, for many of us, our fellow women. And I think what else is beautiful about it is that in creating this sort of impact, you are working with other prominent artists within the space. For example, you most recently did The Body Prepares with Nancy Baker Kale, and making a, a profound, almost a political statement within this space, and really driving the conversations that I think many people often find uncomfortable to address directly. And as you said, art is created to inspire reaction, to inspire feeling and emotion. So, if I do say so myself, I think you're doing an excellent job of it.
Thank you.
Um, we are unfortunately running out of time, but I don't want to leave this conversation without asking what you're currently working on, or some of the works that I think people would be very curious to look forward to.
Well, actually, I'm working on a project, of course, to be released on Tezos that I'm very, very excited about that explores sort of themes of domesticity and the romanticization of domesticity, and seeking to using the tools of the future to retell some of the stories, the false stories of the past, in a way that is truthful, more faithful. So I think that that's going to be a really, really interesting project, and I hope to launch it this summer with someone I deeply respect. So I'm honored to be working with them.
I love the slight suspense and who you'll be working with, because
Yeah,
if there's anything your past collaborations have showed, it's that you're kind of pulling the most powerful voices and figures within the art space to really create something interesting and something novel. Um, and I know we've run slightly over time, and I want to thank you for your patience in dealing with myself as a sick person who perhaps didn't manage to crystallize your ideas as succinctly as I usually would. So I want to thank you so deeply for sharing all of your perspectives, and hopefully this will just be the first of many conversations forward, and we won't have to leave it here.
I hope so. I hope so. It's really great to chat. I really appreciate the space. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. We'll speak again soon.
Yes.